On April 17, 1987, Tecmo unleashed RYGAR to the family computer, and less than 3 months later, the NES. A shorter gap than usual. An alternative title for RYGAR might have been Captain Conan the Ameribarian, but due to that being a bit of a mouthful, RYGAR instead. The game has you muscling your way through the holy land of Argul, slaying man-beast hybrids and seeking out 5 primordial gods called Endora, who were responsible for the creation of Argul. You do this in order to bulk up, at least enough to slay RYGAR, a dragon-man hybrid lion evil king, who has brought forth the kingdom of evil upon Argul, and did so in a single day. It's true. While somewhat silly and cliche in its presentation, RYGAR manages to be somewhat special and a bit of a trailblazer. It manages to successfully combine elements from both Metroid and Castlevania into one, while also providing an innovative level-less leveling system. It's a little rough around the edges, but it makes up for that with a clean, focused experience that is really impressive for the time. Perhaps the first ever Met-lite-vania? Welcome to RYGAR, rough around the edges, aka the first Met-lite-vania. I can't decide on a subtitle. Cue music.
Every one of us is the sum total of his own thoughts. He is where he is because that's exactly where he really wants to be, whether he'll admit that or not. Each of us must live off the fruit of his thoughts in the future. What you think today and tomorrow, next month and next year, will mold your life and determine your future. You're guided by your mind.
RYGAR had a different name over in Japan. There, it was known as Arugosu no Senshi Hachamecha Daishingeki, Warrior of Argos, Great Attack. Additionally, in Japan, the hero is unnamed. Rai and Lai are one and the same in Japan. A distinction being made at all between RYGAR and LYGAR being 2 separate characters is merely a product of localization. I think they thought that RYGAR would just be a more marketable name, and so they just made the hero named RYGAR and kept the main enemy as LYGAR. It's one of those games that has versions for nearly every system that was out at the time, with essentially all of them being super different. Out of all the versions of RYGAR though, the NES Famicom port is the one that seems to be the most fondly remembered. RYGAR for the NES and Famicom isn't just an action game like its counterparts on other systems. It's an adventure game as well, and it's in the same vein as Metroid and Castlevania. It's very much a 2D side-scrolling open world type structure, and it gates your progression through certain areas off in accordance with attaining specific items that allow you to push past various impediments to your quest. The manual definitely proposes a suggested route, and I think you'd be wise to adhere to that. But I didn't, and I had fun, so I guess also, maybe not. In some ways, it's also a little similar to Zelda 2, in that you have locations that act similar to levels that you tackle from a side-scrolling perspective, and you travel between those areas through a hub world and the overhead view. The main difference here being that the overhead view is still one-to-one and not abstracted like it is in Zelda 2. It's almost like when you go into the overhead portion, you're traversing the world in a way that you would traverse the world in Zelda 1. But when you go into a cave or a dungeon like you would in Zelda 1, you're instead transported to a side-scrolling section that is another big piece of the world. While visually the game certainly leans more toward Castlevania, the physics are much more reminiscent of Metroid. RYGAR may be beefy, but he floats like a feather, and like Metroid, you have plenty of time to control him in the air mid-jump. The combat in RYGAR, however, is much more similar to Castlevania. RYGAR uses something known as the disc armor, and while it functions very similar to Simon's whip, it has a significantly longer range when at full power, and it can be spammed much quicker. Because the disc armor is so strong, RYGAR isn't really left wanting for sub-weapons in the same way that Simon is, and the game is designed around the strength of RYGAR's weapon. What it lacks in sub-weapons though, it makes up for in spells, and a unique EXP system that focuses on 2 stats, tone and last. To understand how this works, I think it's easiest to just take a peek at the subscreen. Tone is essentially RYGAR's strength level. The more tone, the fewer amount of disc armor swings needed to fell an enemy. Last is in essence the lasting power of RYGAR. At certain last intervals, you gain a unit of health, which can help you survive longer. But keep in mind that some enemies deal more than 1 unit of damage when they hit you. Just something to look out for. Just because you have 1 health left doesn't mean you're guaranteed to survive a hit from a boss, say. Each enemy in the game has separate allocations for how much tone and last they give you after defeating them. They also have different defenses, and sometimes their stats and tone and last amounts can be different even with the same enemy type. One thing I find really cool and refreshing about RYGAR though is that you never actually level up. The effects of getting stronger in RYGAR are felt rather than announced. As you play the game, you'll start to notice that over time it takes fewer hits to defeat the same type of enemy. And you'll also notice that you can take more hits in return. It's something that I really admire about this game and I would like to see in more games. You're never a certain level, you just have an accumulation of tone and last, and that helps you to grow stronger, and every time you die you hold on to that tone and last. You can always check your current status on the subscreens, but you're not required to, and it's also not really necessary. It's very natural, and it's one of the coolest things about RYGAR to me. The spells in the game are extremely basic, and they're activated by spending mind power, which is the third real attribute associated with the character RYGAR next to tone and last. Mind is different than the other 2 stats though. It feels more like a currency rather than an attribute. It's not really attached to RYGAR. Mind is spent, and unlike tone and last, mind is only acquired through item drops from enemies. There are only 3 kinds of items that can even drop in RYGAR, being single stars, 1 point of mind, double stars, 3 points of mind, and mini potions, which restore a single unit of health on the health meter. While the cost of each spell isn't listed, you won't be able to spend your mind on them unless you can afford them. Power Up is basically required to beat the game, and activating it is your first priority should you die. Which, by the way, when you die, you retain all of your tone and last, but you lose your mind. There's also no saving in RYGAR, so you're really left with only 3 options. Beat it within a single sitting, play it with save states, or leave your NES on and hope no one turns it off. And hope that it doesn't just fail, because it's a 30 to 40-year-old system at this point. Back to Power Up though. Power Up increases the speed and the length you're able to throw the disc armor. Think of it as upgrading Simon's whip to the full-length Morningstar in Castlevania, but even better. This is the least expensive spell too, as it only costs 3 mind. Attack and Assail is my least used spell, but it's really strong. When you use it, for the next 10 swings of the disc armor, it will attack every enemy on screen. If you're finding yourself having difficulty with a specific part or boss and you have the mind points to spare, this can be a compelling option. I didn't make use of it on my first playthrough, but on subsequent playthroughs I found it most useful in getting past the epiclons dropping eggs or stones near the entrance of Mount Primeval. The spell costs 5 mind to use. Lastly, and nearly as important as Power Up, we have Recovery, which costs 7 mind points and fully restores your health. This can feel a bit costly in the early game, but as you accumulate more last and thus unlock more units of health, the timing and usage of this spell, and the practice of making sure that you have enough mind units to cast it before challenging stretches is critical to completing RYGAR. Basically, if you want to progress in RYGAR, you're going to need to be able to heal yourself if you make mistakes. And most people are going to make mistakes. So before you go anywhere or right after you die and you lose all your mind points, you're going to want to fill up your mind points just to make sure you have the ability to heal yourself moving forward. For the tough stuff, basically. RYGAR has infinite continues though, and the game will respawn you at the beginning of whichever area you died in. It's pretty forgiving in that respect. You don't even need some hidden code or secret item. It just lets you continue. Another thing a lot of people like to mention about this game is that the music is pretty good. The Famicom and NES versions of RYGAR are virtually identical, but they do contain differences in the soundtrack. The following locations have different music in the Famicom version. The 𝒆𝒚 mountain range, the Grand Mountains, The song that's used in all of the Old Man and Endora rooms. The song used in Sagala's cave. And most importantly, Durago's palace. I have no idea why they changed that one in localization. Like, what was the reasoning there? But to be fair, I have no idea why they change anything at all. The most important thing regarding the music, though, is that the music for the Tower of Garba remains unchanged. That's my favorite track in the game. The items and their conjunctive use with the world of Argul make the foundation of the Met-lite-vania structure in the game. Met-lite-vania. You cringe when I say it, don't you? The items can be grouped into two categories, and that's made clear by the subscreen. The items available all the time, which are essentially upgrades to RYGAR's traversal and/or survivability, and the items to be selected, which boil down to a consumable slot for a life potion that restores your health, and the Pegasus Flute, which has a singular use, gaining access to RYGAR's flying fortress. The manual in RYGAR is unique in that it kind of spoils the location of where everything is. The first thing you need to get in RYGAR, though, is the grappling hook. The grappling hook lets you reach areas above you or descend to areas below you by holding up or down and pressing or holding B. This is a fun tool to spam just because it looks neat, and it's a fun tool to spam because there are lots of areas where it doesn't look like there's anything above you, but there actually is. It encourages that exploration adventure feeling in RYGAR. The wind pulley lets you cross different lines of rope that you'll see in the game. This is a lot easier in the 2D side-scrolling sections, and it's borderline impossible in the overhead view, even though it is required for a few moments. It's just, am I too tall? Am I too high? Link. Oh, ha. Got it. Similar to the wind pulley, the crossbow allows you to connect lines and then glide across them. Wherever you see a stump in the game, there's a good chance that you can press the B button and fire out a rope from the crossbow. The only issue here is that sometimes the placement of it is still a little finicky, but not as finicky as the wind pulley. The coat of arms is probably less important than some of the other items. While it's recommended you get it right after getting the crossbow, I actually skipped it and I went and got the Endora's armor first. The coat of arms lets you get potions, which are selectable and consumable items that restore your full health instead of having to use the restore spell, from any old man you find in the world. These old men are huge, hulking, gigantic. You'll ask yourself, why doesn't this guy just fight RYGAR or LYGAR? It's the same thing though, because they're sitting there just flexing on you from above you, and you're a tiny little RYGAR compared to them. But they give you really helpful advice throughout the game. That's something that's worth pointing out too. Their tips are very useful, but there are some that just say basically nothing, and if you have the coat of arms, they'll trust you enough to give you a potion. These old men are also placed strategically through some of the harder areas in the game. The Endora's armor serves two purposes. It reduces the amount of damage you take from enemies, and it increases the amount of last you get from defeating them. It's one of the strongest items in the game, but you don't get it until you defeat an enemy strong enough to prove that you could beat the game anyway. Now, the enemies are a strong suit in RYGAR. The enemies are great. They're varied, they change with the locale, and they have satisfying jumps in difficulty. But most importantly, they almost all have distinct behaviors. Some will simply charge at you from sides of the screen. Some will wait until they see you and start floating toward you. Some will circle around you and try and get at you from both sides. And some just appear out of nowhere and remain stationary. Some drop down from above and then run towards you and try and touch you, and others just hang tight and fire projectiles. There are even unique enemies that only appear in the top-down segments. It's a really strong feature of RYGAR, and it makes fighting the different enemies fun, because while your disc armor does basically the same thing every time, you have to use it slightly differently when you're approaching these different types of situations. Also, when it comes to grinding, if you have enough tone, last, and mind to feel comfortable pressing on, or you think that some enemies distribute so little that they aren't worth the trouble, you can, for the most part, just move past them if you'd like. Aside from bosses, defeating enemies isn't actually required, and you can even jump on the heads of some of them, specifically the ones with shells. It won't do damage to them, but for an early 8-bit game, I think it's pretty intuitive design. Their names, though, are a bit rough. Just so you can see all of them, I'll go ahead and list them very quickly. Pragakali, Tsungyokis, Rolfers, Amalems, Folorakos, Hyokings, Red Hyokings, Kinatarnos, Kenobles, Red Kenobles, Mogulins, Red Garzels, Purple Garzels, Gelman, Epolkons, Olbis, Heavy Soldier Bargons, Kazilars, Demoro Bruisers, and then the Shadow Beasts of type A, B, and C. Of those, I enjoy fighting just about every one. For whatever reason, I'm particularly fond of the Mogulins. They kind of remind me of the Red Devils from Ghosts and Goblins, but they're a lot more manageable. The Epolkons, though, are always a challenge, and I don't really like fighting them. The swinging by and dropping the stones, which I thought were eggs at first, is just really annoying. The bosses, on the other hand, don't quite offer anything on the scale of Castlevania. They're definitely solid, don't get me wrong, but the bar was set pretty high with the enemies, and the bosses mostly just feel like beefed up enemies with bigger sprites. Though I suppose that is most bosses in most games. So, Aruga is a slow two-headed monster that creeps towards you slowly and fires projectiles in a specific pattern. It's not too difficult, especially if you've used the power up spell. And the arena that you fight him in will let you jump over him if he gets too close to you. Sagala is a spider-like enemy, and he kind of crawls all around and then he'll try and drop down on you. This is probably the easiest enemy in the game, to me at least. You just kind of walk around and hit him with the disc armor. Belzar is very, very doable and kind of corny looking. You have to climb up to fight him, but once you're there, you can just mash B and just fire the disc armor all over him. He just stands still, so he's not a huge threat. Durago is the first boss that is actually kind of difficult, I'd say. I died to him a bunch, but one of the most proud moments I have in RYGAR is defeating him when I was quite underpowered and only having the base amount of health. I developed a strategy where I was jumping over his projectiles diagonally as I was firing the disc armor at him, and it really felt awesome to kill him that way. Death Pigor is the last boss at the end of the Tower of Garba. He's not really that challenging though. You just dodge as best you can and just fire the disc armor. Same as usual. But then lastly you have RYGAR, and RYGAR actually is pretty hard. In all of my runs, I never managed to beat him on the first try, which is sad because it meant I had to go do some grinding. I think what makes him the hardest boss is that you actually have to hit his head specifically rather than just any point on him. He also seems to have the Death Pigor's heads attached to his hands, or he's holding them on a chain like a chain chomp. But the basic strategy is just to rush him, hit his head as many times as you can, and keep an eye on your health. If your health gets too low, you just pause and use recover, or pause and use one of your life potions. And from there, you just hope for the best. Since I have the opportunity to, and because I think it goes a long way in highlighting what makes this game special, let's take a deeper look at the world, what there is to see there, and how it's all connected. The main top-down central hub of Argul is known as Garloz, and it connects every main location you'll need to travel to in the game. But what's kind of neat is that you don't actually start the game there. You begin the game in the Suro Mountains with a gorgeous, scenic, setting sun to get you in the mood. From there, there's only one direction you really can go, and that's to Grand Mountain. The area before you get to Grand Mountain and Grand Mountain itself were two of my favorite spots to grind in the game. I'm sure there are probably more efficient zones, and I certainly made use of a few other areas myself, but this one is mindless and effortless, and for me, that's the kind of grinding I was looking for. Grand Mountain itself is a really cool area in the game just because it connects you to two zones, it's really large, and it has a few hermits to talk to. And since I'm talking about hermits, which are just huge beefed up old men, it's worth mentioning that these are not the Endora gods I mentioned earlier. The Endora look almost identical to these old dudes, but they have a third eye. Grand Mountain also has really neat trees popping out of the ground. The dead tree aesthetic was a winner in Zelda, and it still works here. Also, I love the purple mountains in the background. It's kind of neat that once you cross between the dead tree area that's leading to Grand Mountain and the one immediately next to Grand Mountain, you can't actually go back without the grappling hook. Though I suppose you could just jump off the ledge. But once you enter Garlaz from Grand Mountain, you're in the main central hub for the entire world of Argul. And this place comes with its own natural set of barriers, including enemies, cliffs, and sections that you need either the wind pulley or the crossbow in order to access. Now, since this isn't a guide necessarily, I'm not going to go into excruciating detail on every little thing, but please enjoy this brief description of what the different zones have to offer. Once you find the grappling hook, which is in a cave in Garlaz that's explained to you by one of the hermits at Grand Mountain, the first zone you're expected to travel to is the Valley of Rölsa. It has a stone aesthetic with water below and really striking green towers that stretch all the way up beyond the sky. If you explore here, you're also really likely to find a tower that goes all the way up to the brink of space, where you can catch a glimpse of RYGAR's floating fortress. You progress through Rölsa though to Uruga Forest. This area requires the grappling hook to make it through, and it has a playful nature to it that has RYGAR exploring the treetops and the thick of the forest in order to make it through. Once you defeat Uruga, you're back to Garlaz, and then it's off to Mount Primeval. You need the wind pulley you receive in Uruga's forest in order to make it to the entrance. This zone has tall gray mountains in the background, and it's mostly just a lead up to the Den of Saglia, where you have to cross gaps with your pulley, and you have to be careful because you're vulnerable while crossing and you can't use your disc armor. Once you make it to the end though, you're in Sagila's Den. And it's such a sick zone, honestly. Technically, you don't even need to go down the first segment because the connections to everywhere you actually need to get to are found in the latter half of the cave, but I didn't know that my first time, and I had a blast exploring. It's deep and dark and vertical, and the biggest challenge is definitely the gaps with orbs that damage you with a little pushback. The deeper you go though, you're gonna see these huge pillars in the background holding up bases of the mountain from the foundation, and it's just got a really nice aesthetic. And you get all these hints and peeks at where you do need to go that you can't quite reach, that you actually do have to make it to the other side in order to get to. It's satisfying to finally make it there. The boss is a chump though. Defeating Sagila means that you have access to the crossbow though, which means you now technically have access to any other remaining area in the game save for RYGAR's floating fortress. You could tackle the Tower of Garba, Durago's Palace, which I did, or Lapis, which is a sky region. Technically, the suggested route is to do Lapis first, then Durago's, then Garba. But after beating Sagila's Den, Durago's was just north of that in the manual, and since I was already there, I wanted to give it a shot. So I'll cover that first. Durago's Palace is basically a very basic gray stone labyrinth, but it's done in the top-down perspective like Garlaz is. It has really awful music in the NES version, but the Famicom track for it is actually somewhat fitting. If you have the coat of arms that you get for completing the Lapis region, the hermits here will help you with life potions, but I didn't have that on my first playthrough. It's not the prettiest zone to look at, but it has its place in the game. It's kind of intimidating, and it's a neat inclusion. Lapis, on the other hand, is really cool visually. Once you make your way up some tall dead trees, you're suddenly in a floating sort of sky world. The big robot guys here with the dumb names are tough at first, but the red sprites really pop, and they're manageable once you get their timing down. There's some trial and error here, but it's fun, and it's kind of funny to see RYGAR just kind of hanging out in the clouds after taking your grappling hook to nowhere. The last area is the Tower of Garba, and it kind of has boss rush vibes to it. Certainly my favorite area in the game, and I'm a sucker for huge towers. I also just have to say that between the valleys, forests, mountains, deep underground, and towers everywhere, this game sort of does remind me of an 8-bit Elden Ring. But anyway, Garba has excellent music. The trek to reach it from the tops of the Grand Mountains is also fun, and it's cool to visit that area again and gain access to a new portion of it. It's part of what plays into that Met-lite-vania sort of feeling it has. And the climb up the tower with the window cutouts is just peak NES aesthetic. Once you beat the final boss of this zone, Death Pigor, at the top, you get the Pegasus flute. And that's the last thing that you need in order to access the final area of the game where RYGAR awaits. The Sky Castle itself is, at minimum, twice as difficult as any other zone. It's beautiful to look at though, but somewhat annoying that you have to make your way around half of its perimeter just to enter it. And once you're in, you're fighting for your life. Making it through has you crossing gaps in the sky and crossing a final one to make it to a stone pyramid looking keep containing RYGAR. Once RYGAR is defeated, the door of peace is opened and peace is returned to the land of Argul. You get a really satisfying ending sequence. And overall, the structure of the game is just kind of neat. The world connects in meaningful ways, and the items gate your progress in certain areas while still giving you options to do more. So it's not like fully Metroid locking you behind something, and there maybe aren't quite enough zones for it to be that full Metroidvania, but a light version. You gotta have an angle. Look, when you make a video like this, you just gotta have an angle. So that's pretty much RYGAR in a nutshell. And I had a pretty good experience with this game. I wanna kind of go through my journey with this game in kind of an off-the-cuff, unscripted manner. When I first tried RYGAR to see if it was something I might want to cover, it seemed a lot more difficult than it actually is. Those early enemies you can just jump past. You don't have to fight every enemy that comes on screen, and you can even jump on top of the backs of most of them in the starting areas. The music's good, the backgrounds are gorgeous. This game does great with sunsets, layers. It's not really parallax scrolling, but the fact that there is a scrolling in the background is really nice. I'm also just a sucker for mountains, and sharp, jagged, rocky mountains are really cool. I feel like I would doodle them in just about every notebook ever when I was a kid. But I think I thought RYGAR was more difficult than it actually is, because the starting areas have enemies that just come at you and they keep respawning nonstop. But in the full game, there are segments where if you don't progress, nothing's actually coming to get you right that second. RYGAR is a really good game to just play and be absorbed by it and then just kind of forget about everything else, the little stuff. So final thoughts for RYGAR for the NES and Famicom. I played RYGAR between 3 and 4 times. I completed it 3 times. And while I like almost everything that it did, it isn't a sticky game for me. It didn't stick to me and really change how I feel about the NES. It didn't really change how I feel about other games that I've already played, like Metroid and Castlevania. I think it's really cool what it manages to accomplish with the different zones. I had a lot of fun traversing with and interacting with the world in RYGAR. It has a really cool climax, and I like that you have to return to an earlier area in the game in order to access it. And the process of going up and going to the Flying Fortress and the actual difficulty level of all the enemies there just being so high, and the little secret areas that you can find where you can replenish your health. It's got a satisfying flow to it. It doesn't waste your time. It's somewhat similar to Castlevania in that it's kind of all killer, no filler. It's mostly killer, limited filler. Because I'm not sure RYGAR is quite at the level of Castlevania or Metroid for me, but I do understand how someone could like this game more than either of those games. It's more accessible. In some ways, it's faster paced. It's really unique. And it's just one of those unexpectedly good experiences. Now, it is rough around the edges. RYGAR does kind of blend into some of the backgrounds. The colors they chose for his sprite maybe aren't the best. There's lots of sprite flickering. Some areas do feel maybe a little more tacked on than others. But for the most part, they do really jive together quite well. Argul feels like a real place. And it also has this oddly kind of old world biblical kind of feel to it. Like it almost weirdly feels like something like that I'd find in art from a children's Bible or something.
Do you know how the world began? How God created it by hand?
But yeah, it's got a unique thing going for it. And while the disc armor is really cool, I still think like I prefer the idea of Castlevania with the more limited whip. It's still really strong. And then the sub weapons to kind of complement that. But it's a game that you have to give props to. It does so much so well. And I struggle to think of an example in the games that I've covered so far that really combine the two ideas of Metroid and Castlevania so well. And yes, there's jank with trying to attach the wind pulley, and it's annoying to have stuff dropped on you as you're forced through a certain zone. I just liked the general flow of it. I like working my way through the forest, then crossing over the water to where I couldn't get before to get the crossbow. Then I loved how on my first playthrough I was able to use the crossbow to go ahead and just tackle the Palace of Durago before I was technically supposed to, and how I was able to beat that, and then going back to Lapis after. Lapis itself is a really cool region, just being able to use the grappling hook in conjunction with the crossbow a lot and just kind of exploring up and down and seeing everything that zone has to offer. And then the Tower of Garba being almost like a boss rush, but just I love that you have to return to the Grand Mountains and then you arrive at the tower and you're just tackling it and the music's just playing and hammering. It's really good. It is a fun game. I'm having fun just thinking about it. RYGAR has a lot of really interesting design elements. There's a lot going on, and it doesn't overstay its welcome either. And it also has the advantage that just about anyone can beat RYGAR. I really think anyone could beat it. It's not quite as hard as Metroid or Castlevania, I think, because if you continue to press on, you're going to get stronger, and eventually you're just going to be able to melt enemies with the disc armor. That's just how it goes. And I think it's really cool that it's natural like that the system is levelless in that way. And it's weird to kind of critique RYGAR is not being 100% for me when it's hard to pick out things about it that I would describe as bad. It's a very good game. I guess I just didn't resonate with it on quite the same levels as I did the other similar games that I played, like RYGAR being Castlevania and Metroid. But it's borderline must play for anyone who likes those style of action-adventure games, especially 8-bit action-adventure games. I think it'd be hard to walk away from RYGAR and say, I had an awful time with that game. It's just, yeah, it's tough to nail down in some aspects. Is it a hidden gem? I think most people probably know about it at this point, so maybe it's just impossible to find a hidden gem. But it's definitely less known than a lot of those other games that I've played so far. I think also if I had to pick, I like the soundtrack for the Famicom just slightly more because it's easier to kind of listen to in the background. It's not quite as bombastic in certain zones. And then it has the benefit of not having that terrible music for the Palace of Durago. There's definitely a special quality to it. It has a very good ending. I like watching it. I like the music. I like how it opens up and you see the land of Argul kind of presented as in peace and everything. It's a really good game. And I feel like I keep searching for something to say and failing to find it. Maybe it'll come to me eventually. But thanks for watching. Peace.